I'm J.G. Michael, and this is Parallax Views.
Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. Independent media matters, and your support makes it possible. If Parallax Views has challenged your thinking, exposed you to new ideas, or simply kept you company on your commute, now's the time to help sustain it. Listen, share, and if you can, support the show on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. If you want, you can also make a one-time donation by contacting me at parallaxviewspod@protonmail.com. I can give you a link to my PayPal page if you contact me that way. Let's show what listener-supported media can do. On this edition of Parallax Views, it's being described as a real-life version of the TV show Squid Game, or the movie The Hunger Games in Gaza. I'm talking about the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, which is mired in scandal right now, as many are accusing it of basically setting a trap for starving Palestinian civilians seeking food for themselves and their families. You see, these Palestinians are going to these Gaza Humanitarian Foundation aid centers and are being shot either at or near the centers. Joining us to discuss this story is Stavroula Pabst of the Quincy Institute's Responsible Statecraft magazine. She's a journalist there, and we're going to be discussing her article entitled, "Is the U.S. Now Funding the Bloodbath at Gaza Aid Centers?" It's a chilling story. There's a good bit we know, and a lot we don't know as this story unfolds. So, with that in mind, let's get right to it with Stavroula Pabst. Welcome to Parallax Views, a guest that I've actually wanted to speak with for quite some time now, because I've been following her work ever since I was digging more deeply into Peter Thiel and the Tillverse. But right now, she's writing more about issues related to geopolitics and U.S. foreign policy at Responsible Statecraft, and she has an article out, "Is the U.S. Now Funding the Bloodbath at Gaza Aid Centers?" Welcome to Parallax Views, Stavroula Pabst.
Thanks for having me.
So, I guess the place we should start is, what exactly is the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation? I know there's some question marks around that.
Yeah, there are a lot of question marks, and I think it is a good place to start. Obviously, okay, if we look at the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation at face value, essentially it claims to be a humanitarian organization distributing aid to Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. I think it says it's distributed tens of millions of meals to Palestinians thus far. Now, of course, behind that veneer, it's essentially been marred from the beginning, or its reputation has been marred from the beginning, basically by reports of daily shootings at Palestinians at these aid hubs, right, by the IDF primarily. We also have a couple reports of American contractors who actually operate these aid hubs shooting at Palestinians as well. We can get a little bit more into the origins of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation if you'd like, because it is something worth walking through. But essentially, the GHF claims, and people who support the GHF essentially are saying that this is a way for them to quote unquote be able to provide aid to Gaza without it getting into the hands of Hamas. That is essentially their line about why they think it's reasonable to do or conduct aid in this way. Now, those claims are disputed, but on top of that, I think it's important for us to point out that a lot of like conventional humanitarian aid groups have said, the GHF's operations aren't necessarily following a lot of standard humanitarian conventions. And when I was writing the article that you mentioned, it was quite frequent for me to find people who said that the GHF's operations seem to be established in ways that almost they did assist Israel's geopolitical goals for the Gaza Strip, and we can get into that as well as you'd like. But in short, it's this questionable humanitarian organization that many Palestinians trying to get aid at have been shot at and have been killed at.
I want to talk more about the exact nature of the criticisms being leveled at the
Yes.
Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, because the way I've seen some people frame it, and it's done in this sort of dark sort of pop culture way, is I see a lot of people comparing it to the movie The Hunger Games or the Squid Games movie. That they're essentially, sending Gazans or Palestinians from Gaza to these aid centers and then shooting them, you know?
Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily say that that description is too off the cuff considering what's gone on. Um, if we talk about the actual nature of these centers, and I think probably your viewers have seen some of the footage, it's kind of clear that the operations are quite chaotic in the first place. Even when you look at the GHF posting about when it's going to provide aid to Palestinians, it sounds like they often get a lot of people there. It's not distributed in an orderly way, and then they run out of food in minutes. So there are frequent situations where a lot of people, there's chaos, there's panicking. And, as I had said earlier when we discussed the operations, unfortunately, this is quite a militarized operation because what we're seeing at these aid hubs is that as I said earlier, they're being managed by private contractors, private military mercenary contractors brought in. They are American contractors, actually, and they are armed. And it's my understanding there have been whistleblowers saying that these American contractors brought to do this work, they're being paid, I think, $1,000 a day. But on top of that, what's worth saying is that they're heavily armed. They've been given little training, and they've essentially been told, look, if there's an issue, you should just shoot. So we're seeing the people that are running these centers do so with little sensitivity to the Palestinian people that are there that are desperate for aid. And of course, as I said earlier, there are IDF forces at these aid hubs that have been told their role is theoretically to secure them. But they are also reported to shoot at these Palestinians on a daily basis. And I think Haaretz reported maybe 2 weeks ago that IDF soldiers were actually instructed to shoot even if no one posed a threat. And the IDF has essentially been said, they frequently said that they've been shooting warning signs at Palestinians if there's an issue or for crowd control. But that obviously conflicts with the reporting I just mentioned. And essentially what you're creating is this very undignified situation for Palestinians. Obviously, there's a threat of being shot at, but it's also just kind of, it's this situation where people are being asked to risk their lives. I don't think it's inappropriate to compare it to Hunger Games, all considering.
So let's talk a little bit. Have we learned anything about this from Israeli soldiers? Have they commented on this in the news or?
I think a couple of soldiers have come out about this, and I do believe Haaretz had noted Israeli soldiers coming out and admitting they had been instructed, but I haven't heard too many more reports of them speaking about their conduct at the aid hubs. There has been some recent reporting on them just speaking out in general about their activities in the Gaza Strip, though.
So, in terms of the origins of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, I've seen a lot of people describe it as a sort of a shadowy organization, but I think it's clear. I mean, it's an Israeli created organization.
Yes, and I can direct you. We've done some reporting on this, and I can also direct you to some New York Times reporting from a little bit ago, where it is essentially an Israeli brainchild. There, this is essentially proposed, actually, originally by Israeli officials near the start of Israel's war on the Gaza Strip in late 2023. There was a forum essentially of officials, tech entrepreneurs, even venture capitalists, others from government, and others from COGAT, for example, which is the Organization of State Aid Coordinators from Israel. But from what I can understand and what the New York Times reported about this is that this group that essentially planned the idea of the foundation was looking for ways to be able to undermine Hamas's control of Gaza or otherwise divert aid from Hamas. That's at least the way they had seen it for themselves. This is essentially what they had come up with. I think it's also worth talking about the funding a little bit. Obviously, the State Department has frequently lauded the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation's operations. They also announced about 10 days ago, almost 2 weeks ago, I should say, that's probably more appropriate. They announced that they would be giving 30 million to the GHF. Israeli opposition politicians have also alleged that Mossad is funding the GHF. So I suppose altogether, what we're seeing is this organization has clear Israeli roots, clear American backing. Um, and even though they purport frequently in their communications, if you check out their Twitter or their website, I should say their X account, they frequently claim to be independent. That's not really an appropriate way to describe them in terms of looking at their funding, looking at who has concocted this, that type of thing. I think it's also worth flagging um, the person that founded, I should say, Safe Reach Solutions.
Right. This
Um,
is CIA officer Paul Riley,
yes,
former CIA officer. Yeah.
yes, and he was actually involved in some of those talks to come up with what is now the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. So this needs to be considered as well. There is that connection. So basically, anybody who says that the GHF is independent, you should show them these ties. You should show them these origins that go back actually to the start of the conflict, really, right?
So, in terms of why the U.S. would back this, can we speak to that a little bit more?
I mean,
I know
that
maybe that's too much conjecture. I wish I could have asked it a better way, but is there any speculation on this?
that's a good question. I'm not sure I'm at length to answer that. I do wonder, if we look at the Trump administration's, let's say, affiliation with Netanyahu, obviously the Trump administration in the past has been pretty on board with Netanyahu's other plans for the Gaza Strip. We can reference broadly the controversial Riviera plan that had been brought up a few months ago. I can't speak to them, and I can't necessarily speak to their hopes of this. They've spoken consistently at State Department press briefings that they too believe this is a way of providing aid to the Gaza Strip without Hamas getting access to it or otherwise using it to their own ends. They say that as well.
You're
But
talking specifically about figures like Tammy Bruce and
yes,
Tommy Pigott at State. Yeah.
yes,
Okay.
they have consistently said that, just as the GHF has said that as well. They've made that talking point many times, but I don't think that that should be taken at face value either. I think Cindy McCain, this is kind of a widely debunked Israeli talking point. Cindy McCain, the head of the World Food Program, essentially came out like a month ago and she was like, look, there's not really a lot of evidence that Hamas does this. I don't know that that should be taken at face value either. I think what also is worth pointing out that is that I actually spoke with a former USAID contractor for the purposes of writing this article, and he said, "Look, it's quite likely that the Trump administration is receiving communications that suggest, um, you know, UNRWA, which has been kicked out of Gaza, did pretty good work. The GHF isn't necessarily capable of doing the same caliber work, and in fact, it's harming a lot of people. I think the State Department is well aware of that, yet they're continuing it. I'm not sure. I'm not sure what their long-term goal is, and I don't want to speak to that. Maybe the very nice way of answering the question is maybe they see this as a way of trying to aim towards providing something while working to some sort of solution. But I don't know. And especially when I look at Netanyahu's, goals for the region and many Israeli politicians' goals for the region, I don't know how I can read that right.
I wanted to ask about this. Who is this Israeli chef and all these other figures that are part of the sort of PR campaign for GHF?
Sure. This is actually a pretty interesting talking point because I think the GHF has actually done quite a lot to put on this image as being, this really premier humanitarian organization. This chef that they've brought on, or this premier restaurateur in Israel, I mean, I don't know that much about Israeli broad popular culture or anything like that, but he has like semi-celebrity status there, is my understanding. He also is a Zionist, and he's used similar talking points again as the GHF and the Trump administration regarding what they think the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation should be doing. I think when considering that spokesperson choice, when pairing it with the rest of the communications, it is an odd picture. They do frequently post, if you've seen their X account, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation uses similar messaging about Hamas, about the work they're doing in the Gaza Strip. And, they're really trying to laud themselves as, doing the work, let's say, in the Gaza Strip. And you've
Right, this sort of
consistently.
not to interrupt you, but like the narrative I guess they're pushing is Hamas was diverting aid, they were taking the aid
Yes.
from the Palestinians in Gaza, and we're giving it to them. Meanwhile, they're getting accused of essentially working with the IDF, and Palestinians getting killed because of this. But yeah, the PR line is Hamas, Hamas, Hamas. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And I think it's interesting, or something that kind of got us into thinking about wanting to report on this, is that, like, we get some of their emails, their communications emails, and yeah, they're similar to their Twitter account, or their X account, I should say, where they're also frequently just boasting about what they're doing. They also are just posting photos of Palestinians smiling, receiving aid, and of Palestinian children receiving aid. And, it's just kind of all together. The picture doesn't, we could just say that the picture kind of leaves you feeling pretty gross afterwards, is maybe the best way of putting it. They're putting on this aggressive PR front that I find to be unconventional for a humanitarian organization. And then, juxtaposing that with reports of deaths almost every day at their centers, which they then deny. I mean, it's quite the picture.
Now I'm assuming GHF. Well, I know this because I read the article, but they did not return your request for comment, right?
No, they didn't. And I think that's actually I'm not surprised by it, because from what I can tell of other people trying to report on the GHF, is that it seems to be hard to get them to want to speak with you. But they do, on a lot of their press emails to me and other journalists, they do say, please contact us via email if you'd like clarification on our reporting or anything like that. But no, I unfortunately wasn't able to get in contact with them.
Now, in terms of human rights groups, can you talk about how they've responded to this?
Yes, and I think that's actually pretty important to discuss here as well. A lot of humanitarian organizations, more conventional humanitarian rights groups, have either called on the GHF to, radically transform their operations or cease operating altogether. There are complaints about, just certain standards the GHF carries out. A lot of it is odd, if not, again, as we said earlier, perhaps meeting Israel's needs or goals in the region. I think a couple examples of this are simply, for example, the GHF only has 4 aid distribution hubs in the Gaza Strip right now. Okay, so this means that a common complaint that's been levied is that, okay, if people in the Gaza Strip would like aid, they therefore have to walk to get this aid that's far away from them. This isn't really typical in humanitarian work. You would typically bring aid to people in need. It's also forcing people to enter a functional war zone to get that aid. So that's something that people would say is odd. Another I think another statement that I had heard while doing this reporting was, look, another thing is that the GHF is giving essentially mostly non-perishable items like rice, pasta type stuff. This is a problem, practically speaking, because many people receiving the aid then may not be able to cook it if they don't have drinking water, right? So there are some practical concerns being levied at the GHF's operations, save all the other reports of people being shot at their aid hubs. But as I hinted earlier, some of this gets a little bit more into, okay, is there a political motive for this? Something that has been commented on a lot is that once again, the GHF has 4 aid hubs total. They are all in Gaza's center and south. 3 of them, I think, are in Gaza's extreme south. Okay, functionally, then what you're doing is you're saying that if you are based in the north of Gaza, you need to go to the other end of the strip to get this aid. So the allegation with that is, gee, is Israel using the placement of these hubs to try to draw Palestinians out of Gaza's north, right? That is kind of the charge being put there. I also think it's worth highlighting work from environmental researcher Yaakov Garb, I think is his name. He was looking at the composition structure of these aid hubs and their location in the strip. And it's my understanding that he essentially said, or his conclusion was, look, it seems that these aid hubs are more conducive to military operations than they are about genuine humanitarian operation. So, I mean, I think altogether, when we look at the work of the GHF and we look at Israel's goals for the region, we have to ask questions about why that has been done or why things are being set up in that way. And of course, I haven't even touched there on the daily reports or the near daily reports that the GHF has been denying where the IDF has been shooting at Palestinians. So altogether, it's a pretty grim picture. I think a lot of the humanitarian organizations, circling back to that, they've pointed that out. They've essentially said this cannot continue. I think one of the charges in the article that I think I mentioned this, I could be wrong. I think I mentioned that some humanitarian organizations claimed that the GHF, if it continued the operations in the same way, that it would be liable for human rights violations, So they have lobbied these allegations against the GHF. They have said that this is inappropriate, and they have also said, it's quite a situation or an issue that Israel has phased out a lot of other aid, but is essentially making Palestinians go to them first and foremost, right? Like I said earlier, Israel kicked out UNRWA. There have been many times where almost no aid, if no aid has been allowed into the strip. That is something that has changed at times, but essentially what's happened is that Israel has barred a lot of conventional aid from reaching the Palestinian people, and instead it's pointing to this solution that has these clear Israeli and American ties, right? They're not pointing to a solution that is normal, or I should say conventional is the better word to put there. They're not pointing to a conventional solution. They're pointing to one that they have been able to help construct, that has caused a lot of suffering and pain.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it's, for those who have been living under a rock or haven't followed this story, I mean, even the IDF is saying that it's going to have to investigate the shootings at and around GHF aid hubs as possible war crimes. Now, I'm not saying the IDF is necessarily going to do a great job with that, but I mean,
Mhm.
they're being forced to acknowledge that this is happening. Um, and, the cynic in me says that this could potentially be an issue, like what you said with the human rights groups pointing this out. It's almost like, you know, uh, Palestinians are being baited into moving into areas where they're going to get shot because they're entering the crosshairs, essentially. Um, I know we can't say that definitively yet, but I guess human rights groups sort of asking this question seems very relevant because that gives weight to the possibility that those accusations could potentially be true.
Right, right. I mean, this is something, and it's actually good that you pointed that out. Like, even the IDF has had to say, look, we're going to investigate this, or we're going, okay, they're saying that. We don't know necessarily what they'll do with that, but even they have been forced to say, okay, we understand that there has been a problem here. Um, but yes, I mean, this is becoming a common charge. And I think more broadly speaking, it's been kind of said that, look, aid is being weaponized. It's inappropriate, broadly speaking, that you're pairing aid distribution with people that are there with arms that frequently shoot at people. You're creating this militarized humanitarian solution that you're forcing Palestinians into.
Yeah, and I think the human rights organizations are important in this regard because, unfortunately, I think a lot of people look at stories like this and just say, oh, well, is this a conspiracy theory? So I think the human rights organizations saying this really gives weight, that there are real questions that need to be asked.
Yes, I agree with that as well. And I think it's also just a frustrating thing because it's like you can tell that they're very frustrated in the sense that a lot of them really can't provide aid. And it's like whatever problems or critiques you may have of these organizations, the positive of many of them is that many of them, like UNRWA, for example, UNRWA was operating in the strip for a long time. It had established ties to the community and it had kind of clear report, let's say. And so that's been replaced with this, right?
If I could, I was wondering, you interviewed Anel Shaline for this piece. She's a good friend of the show, multi-time guest. Could you talk about her insights?
Sure. And I mean, I can't speak to it in full, but I think that she feels pretty similarly as I do. We had spoken a little bit about the GHF's media operations or their social media presence. And I think she essentially felt that, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation feels compelled to put on this veneer that it's doing good because it needs to distract the public from the reality that people are dying at their aid centers.
Well, also
Uh,
it's a way to dispel the image that Israel is. I mean, there was like deliberately allowing no food in since like March 2nd, and then GHF comes along to dispel that image. It's like, no, we're actually helping, the starving population.
Actually, that's a really important point. I think that the organization, and she had talked about this some, is that, the organization, if Israel is able to say, look, it's not like we aren't letting any food go into the Gaza Strip. Actually, we do have this major organization in the Strip presently. It is a major way. I don't know if it will work, but it is one way for Israel to essentially say, see, we are doing something. It's not like something isn't being done. And again, I think it's interesting how similar some of those points are to the things the State Department has said about it. Tammy Bruce again has consistently said, hey, at least they are doing something, and reporters have been pretty busy to ask questions about it at the press briefings that have been occurring, and that's essentially the response. At least something is occurring. So that's essentially been what we have talked about. And I think that that's actually really important as well, because it is kind of a way for Israel to try to skirt accountability for what it has done in the Gaza Strip. I think that's really important to harp upon as well.
You know, I felt like your article on this, because I've interviewed other people that started talking with me about this, Richard Silverstein at the Tikkun Olam blog, but he was focused more on the Israeli aspect of it, Israel's
Mhm.
involvement. I think you went in a different direction in that you also dealt with, as you said, this former CIA officer, Paul Riley, and Safe Reach Solutions, this, U.S. based private contracting firm. How important is it for us to start looking at the role of U.S. private contracting firms in all of this? Because I think that's getting overlooked in a lot of the coverage. I think you're one of the few that is pointing it out.
Yeah, this is a really important topic, and I've done some reporting on this on and off since it was announced that private contractors would be operating in Gaza in some way. Um, Now, I think I think there are a lot of things that could be said about this. And while I have spoken with people that are experts or who are former contractors in their own right, I'm not necessarily sure I can depict all of this exactly as I'd like to, but I think what needs to be said is, look, these contractors that are coming into Gaza, they are American. It's not really always clear what legal jurisdictions dictate their behavior if they're operating outside their country in functionally a war zone. They're private contractors, which means they're not, they have military training, but they're not, it's not like it's the US Army coming in. So the legal jurisdictions that they are under, and let's say what type of accountability they might face when something goes wrong are quite unclear at many times. That's something that I think is really important when we discuss something like the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, because let's say, God forbid, even though I think this is already, they have been accused of shooting at Palestinians at the aid hubs, unfortunately. But if they do shoot at someone, if they commit XYZ crime or cause a commotion, etc., it's not really clear who can hold them accountable for that. So I think that that's really important to discuss when we talk about these ADA hubs and how they are being run, because the IDF is present at them. Their role reportedly is to secure the aid hubs, whatever that means. But actually, the contractors are the ones who are operating them. So that's really important to note. I think that this is kind of a tenuous line they are taking when they're operating somewhere like the Gaza Strip. And I think it's also important to discuss when we discuss the contracting that's going on in the Gaza Strip is that, UG Solutions and Safe Reach Solutions are also a little bit sketchy in their own right. And I've done some reporting on this, as we had established earlier. Safe Reach Solutions was founded by a former CIA officer. It's not a lot is known about these companies. It's quite hard to get in contact with them. but those types of connections to the U.S. government are clear, right? It would be nice to know more. I haven't really had a lot of luck getting in touch with them.
It's
So,
interesting how all these, not to interrupt you, but it's interesting
no,
how
you're
these
good.
contractors are always founded by someone that used to be in the agency or used to be in government. It's always that revolving door.
Yes. Yeah. And I think what's tricky here is that, we don't know so much about these companies. We know that they're pretty new. I was able to find their theoretical addresses, et cetera. But yes, I mean, it seems like both companies were established a little bit before they were needed for this purpose, let's say. But yeah, it's interesting that they have clear either intelligence or military ties in both cases. And again, it's just a situation where there's not really a lot of accountability. Um, these private mercenaries are there to make money. They're not necessarily there to, they're there for those types of reasons. And I think it's my understanding that a whistleblower who was serving as a contractor has come out and he basically said, look, we haven't received any training. We've essentially been told, like, look, if there's a problem, if you're worried that you could get harmed, it's all right to just shoot first and ask questions later. So we have a whistleblower who's even kind of come in to confirm these are not necessarily situations that are being thought through carefully, or at least from the contractor side of things, right? People are sent in as contractors. Their operations seem to be questionable. There's even footage from AP, I think, that came out last week where it seemed that contractors were apparently bragging about shooting a Palestinian. I mean,
Yeah,
it
I
was,
saw that AP video and it was interesting because the GAF just responded by saying, no, the AP story, the claims, their conclusions are completely false. It was just like denial, denial, denial. But go on, I'm sorry
yes.
for interrupting.
No, no, no. I mean, that's important too. I think it's important to say that the GHF has also denied a lot of reporting on things that have happened at their aid centers, even though, I mean, for example, the shootings that have occurred at these aid centers where IDF soldiers have shot at Palestinians, that happens almost every day. It is reported by a wide number of organizations. Yet the GHF's typical response is to deny that reporting, and not just to deny that reporting, but to also say, that Hamas has spread this idea that these incidents are ongoing. They have also even said that much, and if you look at their X account, they speak to that some, right?
Right. And then they also say, well, we're doing our own investigation. Yeah.
Yeah, right. I mean, it is what it is. I mean, it's a little disheartening to see them communicate like that. And so far, they've been allowed to do that without a lot of accountability. But of course, as we've said earlier, a large number of organizations have come out and spoken against them. I think there has been a lot of public pressure.
Well, I
Um,
would even say, not
or-
to interrupt you, but I would even say there's been good media coverage of it. I mean, Haaretz, I mean, the Associated Press, I mean, these are not like, these are pretty mainstream outlets.
Yes.
Yeah.
Mainstream outlets have consistently reported on this. You can consistently go to them and expect to see they will have commented on an incident on very dishearteningly going on at the GHF. Yes, this has received a lot of mainstream coverage, actually.
Do we know anything about the reported numbers of deaths at these or around these aid centers? I think the Gaza Health Ministry has reported 600 Palestinian deaths and 4,200 wounded since they opened. But I mean, I don't know if we have any numbers outside of that report.
I think those are the main numbers that I have heard as well. I would have to go back to see if I have the exact stat, but I mean, even that number is pretty disheartening considering I think they started their operations at the end of May of this year. So they've only been carrying out this so-called aid work for, not even 2 months now, not even close to that, really. And, the deaths are already in the hundreds. It's quite disheartening, but I don't have more information on that. No.
I was also going to ask, I know that you wrote a piece for this at Responsible Statecraft, but also Adam Weinstein, who's also a colleague of yours at Quincy, wrote a very interesting article about 2 days after yours entitled Charges of U.S. Contractor Shootings in Gaza Recall Ugly Blackwater Era. I know Adam isn't here to speak with us, but what do you think about that comparison that he made that, the U.S. contractor involvement in this does recall, the Blackwater scandals?
Yes, it does. And I think that that's, why contractor involvement, even though, of course, in this case, it isn't Blackwater, it's other organizations, it does recall that. When I think about Blackwater, I do think, or I recall similar incidences in terms of, people operating as mercenaries within a private capacity, not necessarily having, clear jurisdiction to what they're doing. And then, if something goes wrong, there's not necessarily clear who is going to hold them accountable. I think it's also worth pointing out when we discuss these contracting operations, they're hired as contractors. They obviously they don't necessarily have protections either. I mean, at least if somebody's in the army, there's unfortunately a lot of political issues with this in the United States about whether veterans really get respect or protections. But okay, as veterans, they are entitled to certain services in the United States, right? A contractor has this service, but then, when they leave it, they don't have that either. I mean, this is a multi-pronged phenomenon that, generally speaking, deserves more coverage, considering how frequently it's being employed in tenuous geopolitical situations. Obviously, the Gaza what's going on in Gaza is one example. Something else I reported on recently is that Eric Prince, who had founded Blackwater. Obviously, Blackwater doesn't exist anymore, but he has been involved in a deal with the Haitian government to bring private mercenaries to Haiti. So this is not something that is a rare phenomenon, yet it doesn't really get a lot of coverage, broadly speaking. I think part of that is just due to how legally tenuous it is. Some of it just doesn't seem quite real. When I look at their operations in the Gaza Strip, it's quite amazing that they've been brought on to this project to operate in a private capacity, yet they have arms. They could also theoretically commit crimes. They could hurt people, yet, it's not really clear how we, the international community, deal with that, right?
So, is there anything I've missed that you wanted to cover briefly here, or did we cover all the bases?
I would say that we've more or less covered all the bases. I think I would just want to emphasize that if anybody wants to look more into the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, they need to understand that it is a militarized operation first and foremost. And to really be skeptical about its roots, where it does portray itself as independent, where really it's covered in the fingerprints of both Israeli interests as well as American aid.
Well, I want to thank you again, Stavroula Pabst, for coming on Parallax Views. Hopefully, we can do this again when you have another article out. And
Yeah,
thank you so
great.
much.
Thanks for having me.
This edition of Parallax Views is brought to you by the $10 and above tier supporters of Parallax Views on Patreon. So, with that in mind, producers credit shoutouts to
Galen, Matt,
Gunnar, Mark,
Simon,
Alexander, Catherine,
G,
Tilo, Emilia,
Jeremy,
Jeff,
WV,
John,
Bert,
Brian, Elliot,
Darko,
Michael, Brace,
James,
Nick,
Mark M, Mersham,
Galen,
Gareth,
Arlen, Bo,
Christopher, Michael,
Gigadelic Media,
Will,
Chance, Chase, Dan,
Big Bob, David H, Y. Kellerman,
Saaded 13, Kathleen, David, Ava, Bob, The West Bank Robbery Podcast, Jamie, Enoch, Gary, Max, Ishtofer, James, Martin, Matthew Ho, Brian, Nobody, Thomas, and Dano. Well, that does it for this edition of Parallax Views. As always, please consider supporting me on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. And with that being said,
until next time, you've been listening to Parallax Views with Parallax Views to Parallax Views with Parallax Views.
The way out is not simply to say, don't do it, just to prohibit. It's nothing else. If we don't do it, others will be doing it like crazy. So, we have to confront the problem. But no, basically, I know of the great anxieties, problems, new forms of control, but it's also new forms of freedom. This is why I always emphasize that internet and all this new digital stuff, it's a very ambiguous phenomenon, but it's the field of struggle. New forms of enslavement, but at the same time, new incredible forms of freedom. We have to accept the fight with no nostalgia for old, allegedly more authentic communities or whatever. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid.